Well, welcome back to Session 2 of Home Team. Remember, the vision for this course, it's not just training for parents. It's to help entire families work together toward the same goal. That one family has one goal, and coming together, that's what forms the home team. We talked last session about a big part of that is that more and more as kids grow older and into the teenage years and into adulthood, that they be allowed to make choices. Not just allowed to, some are going to need to be pushed, to be encouraged to make choices, to begin to release the control, because adulthood is coming, and it's coming sooner than most of us as moms or dads would ever expect. So we talked in that first session, this has always been part of God's plan. This is how He measures how much we've learned. And so in session 1, we talked about how the Father in this story in Luke 15 allowed His Son to make choices. He says, there's two paths in front of you. There's a fork in the road. The decision is yours. And that's a struggle for us as parents because we know more than our kids did. We did some dumb things when we were their age, and everything in us wants to make those choices for our kids so they'll experience less pain. It's motivated by love, but ultimately it sabotages our efforts, because if we make too many of the choices for too long, the warning is that likely as an adult, that child may grow up to be immature, because it's in the choices, the learning to navigate the many decisions of life. That's one of the best, fastest paths toward maturity. It would be easy if all we had in the scripture was that part of the story to go, whoa, I don't know how that's going to turn out. I'm not sure I would do that. I'm not even sure I agree with that. Well, maybe that's God, so He knows which choices to make. The Father represents God, but I'm not God last time I checked. And so I think I better just stay with my control path. Scripture always brings balance to itself. And as the story continues to unfold tonight, we're going to look at this second session, which is called Consequences. There's, again, just a couple of verses here. It's not a lot of scripture for this section, but starting in Luke 15, verses 13 through 16, it says, "Not long after that, the younger son got together all he had, set off for a distant country, and there squandered his wealth in wild living. After he had spent everything, there was a severe famine in that whole country, and he began to be in need. So he went and hired himself out to a citizen of that country, who sent him to his fields to feed the pigs. He longed to fill his stomach with the pods that the pigs were eating, but no one gave him anything." The consequences in this story are pretty severe. None of us would wish this upon our son or our daughter. None of us who are listening to this, who are kids or teenagers, none of this would want our life. This is my life goal. I want to end up in a pig lot competing with my dinner with the pigs and what they're trying to eat. This is compounded by the fact in this story, this is a good Jewish boy. If you have friends who are Jewish, you know that pigs, they're not kosher animals. And so for him to even take this job would have meant just one of the lowest points of his life. Can it get any worse? Yeah, it can. Because he's so hungry, he's actually trying to eat the pig's food. That's not how it looked at first. That's something about consequences. They sometimes take a while to unfold. At first, this is the best decision I ever made. I've got all this money, and if you have money, you have friends. But you know what? When the money ran out, his friends ran off. And he finds himself alone, and he's far, far, far away from home. And the dream that he had, life is just not unfolding like he had hoped it would. Our hand sign for consequences is this, and it won't make sense at first, but it'll come clear as we go through this session. Remember, this is choices. Do that with me. Choices. Good. This is the second one. This is consequences. Say it. Consequences. Why is that the hand sign? We'll discover that as we go through here. Somebody, an anonymous author, once said this. They said, when a child is allowed to do absolutely as he pleases, it will not be long until nothing pleases him. And consequences are God's built-in way of making mid-course directions when we start to make choices that are not good ones. We've seen in the passage what it says. Not long after that, he takes his inheritance and he goes off, and initially it's great. But just by a few verses later, the bottom is falling out. And one thing about the bottom falling out, you think you've hit bottom, and there's always a lower layer that we can fall to, and that's what he's experiencing. The lesson in this is just exactly what we said. The Father allowed his Son to experience consequences. Say consequences. What's the struggle for us as mom and dads? We love our kids. We love our kids. I don't like my kids to suffer. And so everything in me, the struggle is this. I'm tempted. Your parents are tempted to rescue you, to prevent you from experiencing pain. That's a loving response. That's a good hard wiring in there. But ultimately, it becomes self-defeating if we're not balanced with it. I can remember when I was pastoring up in Illinois years ago, we were just starting to have kids. And one of the things great about being a pastor without kids, or when your kids are real little, is I had all the answers for everybody else. I was a much more brilliant parent and counselor before our kids started to grow up. I had all the answers for everybody. But one day I'm in my office, and I'm not sure what I was doing, but the phone rang. And I picked up the phone, and the voice on the other end, I recognized it was one of the moms in our church. And she says, Pastor, I need your help. I need to know the will of God. And I sat up a little straighter, because it's like, those are not, you don't get many of those calls as a pastor. Usually you get, hey, I've got a question about your sermon last Sunday. And you're like, okay, what? That joke you told in the introduction, that was hilarious. I had somebody I wanted to tell that with. Can you do that joke again? And you're like, oh man, that's all you remember from Sunday? But this was better. Pastor, I need to know the will of God. And I sat up straight and I said, in what area are you struggling with God's will, my friend? And she said, and I won't use his name because they still know us and they may be watching this, but they'll remember this. She said, so-and-so, my son, forgot his lunch today. Her son at the time happened to be a junior in high school. And I said, and the struggle with God's will would be what? And she goes, well, I want to take it to him at school. And she goes, but I'm not sure I should. What is the will of God? And we know as pastors, whenever y'all put the W in God, it's a serious matter. What is the will of God in this situation? So I'm like, she's struggling with this. And I said, well, has this ever happened before? Oh, yeah. Yeah, I think last week. He forgot it twice just last week. It seems to happen at least once every week. He forgets his lunch. I said, well, what have you done in the past? She goes, I've taken it and I've dropped it off at the school office so that he'll have something to eat. And I said, is that working? Dr. Phil would say, how's that working for you so far? You know, and I ask her that, and she goes, well, obviously that's not fixing the situation. I'm thinking today maybe I shouldn't take it to him. And I said to her, I think you have just discerned the will of God. Don't take him his lunch today. Okay, thank you, Pastor. Hangs up. 5 minutes later, the phone rings again. Same lady. Pastor, are you sure that is the will of God? Well, I don't have a chapter and verse for you, but what you've been doing hasn't been working, so why don't you try something new? Okay, will you pray with me? Okay, I'll pray with you. Hang up. Third time she calls. I don't think I can do it. And I said to her, and I called her by her first name, I said, when I see you on Sunday, I'm going to look you in the eye and I'm going to ask you if you caved in and took it to him. Because the more we talk, there's no possible way you should take. Well, this isn't just an average day. He actually has a track meet tonight. And if he doesn't do well, this is the regionals. And he's got a long shot at qualifying for state. But if he doesn't eat, no, I said, do not take him his lunch. Yeah, that was very easy for me. I think Emily was maybe a year old at that point and Phil hadn't been born yet. So I'm doling out all this advice. I get that struggle now. It's so easy to want to rescue our kids. When Emily was in middle school, I'm not exaggerating, like once a week, usually at dinner time, the phone would ring, and it was one of the moms from one of her classmates. Now, this is like 8th grade or something, right? And the mom would say, Emily, I have a question. What do we have due tomorrow in whatever the class happened to be? What do we have due tomorrow in geometry? What do we have due tomorrow in geography class? What do we have due in history? And Emily would go through what the assignment had been, and the parent would say, thank you. Well, one day, the phone rang right on schedule. And so I happened to answer the phone. She goes, this is Mrs. So-and-so, so-and-so's mommy. I'm sure an 8th grade boy wants to have his mommy, referring to her as that way. And she says, anyway, can you put Emily on the phone? I need to know what we have due tomorrow. And I just said to her, it's kind of rude actually, I said, did you say we? I said, I don't know about you, but I went through junior high once. It was not a particularly great experience. I was pretty much of a nerd. There's no way I want to relive those years. You're not really going back through junior high again, are you? I said, you don't have an assignment. Your son has an assignment. Are you doing his homework for him? Call ended quickly. Those phone calls stopped. Found out that those calls didn't really stop. They just moved from who eventually was the valedictorian, Emily, to who eventually was the salutatorian years later in high school. It's easy to be critical of a mom who does things like that, but that's motivated by love. But what I think you'll see in this situation is there's a problem with that long term, because the warning is this: without consequences, children often grow up to be irresponsible. They often grow up to be irresponsible. Why is that? Well, this is where our hand sign for this one comes through, because God has designed into the universe, consequences are part of God's plan. It's the law of sowing and reaping. Galatians 6:7 says, do not be deceived. God is not mocked. Whatever you sow, that's what you're going to harvest. There's a connection between the planting and the harvest that's produced. You don't plant lettuce and harvest apples. What you plant determines what the crop will be eventually. And as parents, if we interrupt that law of the harvest, the law of sowing and reaping, and if we do it too many times, what happens is that built-in connection that God has hardwired into the universe between choices and consequences, we interrupt that. And it's as if our kids have planted poison ivy or thorns in the backyard, and while they're sleeping, we go around behind them and we tear up that wrong stuff and we plant beautiful flowers. What have the kids learned through that? Well, the easy answer is to say nothing. I wish it were nothing. They've actually learned way more than nothing. They've learned that it doesn't matter what I do. It's all going to turn out all right anyway. And I think we would all agree that the longer we live in life, we realize that just absolutely is not the way that the world functions. That's not the way things go in life. One teacher, one time I was sharing some of these truths, and she came up and she says, I wish I had had that this summer. I said, why? And she says, right in about early August, a mom of a student that I'd had the past school year came to me, and she says, I happened to be out doing some work in the yard, and this mom came to me and said, hey, here's my son's book report. He didn't get it done in May when it was due. It's now August. I know grades are already in, but he's got big dreams for college someday, and if you'll grade this and kind of go back and fix that, it'll get him a higher grade. I'm sure you'll take care of that for me. This teacher wisely said no and actually had to have the backing of her administrator. But that's what this becomes if we don't get a handle on this area. So this hand sign, consequences, reminds us that what we plant is what we'll eventually harvest. The seed becomes the fruit. You know something about consequences, they can be either positive or negative. I've given you several negative examples. The story itself has a negative example. The son takes his inheritance, he goes, he wastes all of his money, he lives a crazy, probably immoral lifestyle, and then come the consequences as a result of that. That's an example of negative consequences. And negative consequences are designed to make us not want to make a bunch more foolish choices. It's a correction. But consequences can also be positive, because when we experience positive consequences, when we plant good things and there's good results of it, then we know more. I'm going to do more of that in the future. That was a good decision. Positive consequences are every bit as important. Take a look, mom or dad, at your parenting, because it's easy for us to just get in the mode where I'm all about negative consequences. My job is providing the discipline. It is. But you know, we can teach just as much, sometimes more, by what we reward by bringing positive consequences. Well, what does that mean? It means one of our kids who struggled with procrastination a lot, they would have summer reading that they were assigned by their school every year. And man, I cannot tell you how much got read in the last week or 2 or 3 days before school. And finally, with enough years of this, it wasn't just stressful for them. It was stressful for all of that. And so Ellen actually had this idea. She said to this child, said, hey, I'll make you a deal. Dad and I talked about it. If you will finish your summer reading by the end of July instead of a photo finish at the end of August, if you'll finish your summer reading by the end of July, then you can bring a friend with us when we go to the mountains, or you may say the beach, or wherever you're going. You can bring a friend and we're going to go out to a fun place to dinner together. Well, what if they don't finish it? Then they don't get to bring the friend along. You don't leave your kid home and go, okay, you stay home and do your reading. We're off to the beach for 6 days. That's probably too severe of a consequence, at least when kids are younger. But that was an appropriate reward that was offered. Many of you may use chore charts. Some of you use those a lot in your home. We used it some when our kids were younger. And Ellen, years ago, had this really good idea. One of our kids, you couldn't get this child to make his or her bed. I'm trying not to tell you which one it was. And Ellen came up with this creative idea. She said, I'll make you a deal. If 25 out of the next 30 mornings you make your bed without me having to nag you about it, if you hit 25 out of 30, that soccer ball that you've been wanting to have, we'll buy you that at the end of the 30-day period. You know what happened the first day? They didn't make their bed. Now that's why it's good to not have a standard like if you go 30 days straight, because you just lost a month if they miss on day one. Perfectionism is the thief of joy. Trust me, I was raised by 2 perfectionist parents. My dad got my mom a bumper sticker one time that said, people who think they're perfect really annoy those of us who truly are. That actually happened, and Mom started to put it on the car, and Dad's like, Phyllis, lighten up. That's a joke. And she goes, but it's so true, Gail. That's where I was raised, so trust me. I know all about this. Ellen was wiser about that, and so she says, if you'll make your bed 25 out of the next 30 days, then comes the reward. That's a great way of approaching this. Just a note, just a comment in the margin, a parenthesis. You may notice as this series goes on that I may tell more stories about our son Philip than our daughter Emily, and that could make you wonder, wow, whatever happened to Emily? I bet her life must have turned out to be a real mess, or obviously he loves his son more. Look how much he talks about. That has nothing to do with it. It all goes back to the personalities of our kids being very different. Same gene pool, same environment, total opposite in their wiring. Emily, even from an early age, was like, I don't want to hear stories about me when you're preaching, Dad. Later on, she shorthanded that, and she's like, yeah, I was born, they gave me in Dad's arms, and Dad looked down and went, oh, what a bouncing bundle of sermon illustrations. She's got my snarky sense of humor. But she said, you don't talk about me publicly. Now, I have cheated a few times, probably more than a few times. I have a few times, especially if Emily is sitting there saying, you all know I don't have a daughter, but if I did and her name were Emily, and she's shaking her finger at me, I would tell you about the time that she did this. And then, well, I pay for that at lunch. Philip, on the other hand, very different. He'd say, Dad, you can tell any story you want about me. And would it help people to follow the story better if you put my picture up on the PowerPoint so they could see me while you were telling that story? Two very different kids. So probably you're going to get about 75% Philip stories because I'm still scared of Emily and breaking that rule. Consequences, just like choosing stories, must be tailored to the child's age and the child's personality. You know, when they're younger, the consequences have to be short term. A 5-year-old doesn't get at all. Now, if you will do this, 2 months later will be the reward. They can't carry time like that. The reward, whether positive or negative, has to be more immediate. If there's discipline involved, there ought to be a far less severe discipline. I was told one time that if you use time out, where kids go in isolation for a time, that a good rule of thumb is to start out early on, at least up to about age 10. It's a minute for each year of their age. We didn't follow that exactly, but you see the point that early on, the consequences need to be more immediate, they need to be more simple, and you've got to explain them. As kids get toward the end of elementary school or on into junior high, then it begins to change. The consequences can be more longer term, both the rewards and also the discipline. And then especially as they get into high school, for kids to begin to be able to predict, if I do this, this is what will happen. And sometimes for that to be laid out in advance, like if you come home late, this is what will happen, so that they know the consequence. And we eventually got with our kids, sometimes they would mess up. If you're getting the idea our kids were perfect, that you're just totally wrong about that. We had the normal struggles that every family has growing up. But we always worked together, or most of the time we'd come back together, this view of one family, one goal, and united as a home team. And so sometimes we'd say to Philip or Emily, okay, you did this, you know that was wrong. What do you think the consequence should be? And you know the really weird thing about it is most times they would actually choose a more severe consequence than we would have picked. And you sit back as a parent and you're like, okay, we have some really bad days, and some days I don't think we have a clue what we're doing, but we just had a good day. That worked today. It's not just their age, though, it's their personality. Even what is appropriate discipline for them. Philip, who's just this social people gatherer, I mean, he can throw a party together in no time. People just want to be with him. If we put him in timeout, if we sent him to his bedroom and shut the door, he didn't have a phone, he didn't have a computer, there was no TV in that room, it's just Philip. And we had to deal with him. We'd say, if you ask to get out early, we're adding 5 minutes to it. So maybe he had 10 minutes, and 8 minutes in, he's like, Dad, you got to let me out. Well, Emily was the scorekeeper. She'd go, oh, Philip, you were down to 2 minutes, 2 plus 5. Now it's up to 7, buddy. What were you thinking? And we're like, we'll be the parents, Emily. You just be his sister. Thank you very much. And that to him, I mean, one time he just begged me, he goes, Dad, don't add 5 minutes, but I need to talk to you. And I go into his room. He goes, we need to make a deal. I can't stay in here any longer. I'm willing to do this, or I'm willing to do this, or I'm willing, and much more severe consequences than just staying in your room a few minutes, because he wanted to tunnel out of there. And I remember one time, I started down the hall, and Ellen goes, don't cave. I go, cave? What do you mean? I teach parenting stuff. She goes, do not cave. And I go down there, and so I talk to him, and then finally at the very end, I don't realize Ellen's like standing by the doorway listening. And Philip, I say to him, Philip, there's no party going on out there. You're not missing anything. There is no party. And he looks at me with those big brown eyes. He goes, let me out of here. And there could be. And I hear Ellen in the hallway just bust up laughing. And Philip hears her too. And I walk out. I go, who caved this time, hon? Anyway, with Philip, very effective. Emily, you put her in timeout, even if it was a longer time, like a half hour. And then you go to check on her and you're like, okay, hon, you can be released now. She would go, okay, I got like 3 more chapters I want to read. I'll be out in a while. Because it was protection from her annoying little brother. That wasn't even discipline. That was a positive consequence for her. So these things have to be tailored, not just to the age, but to the personality of our kids. You know, one thing about consequences is they're not always immediate. This is something that even as adults we struggle with. The writer of Psalms would multiple times say to God, God, how come the righteous people, the people who are trying to obey you, their lives stink, and those who are rebelling against you, they seem to be the ones getting the blessings? What's the deal? This whole sowing and reaping thing is broken. That's the thing about consequences. They're not always immediate, but they do eventually yield the harvest based on what was planted. But consequences, they can be allowed or created. What does that mean? Well, partially it's because of the fact that sometimes they take too long to unfold. They can be allowed. Sometimes it's just a matter of not intervening, not interrupting. One of our kids, not my son, but I won't mention who it was, had trouble with oversleeping. And Ellen would repeatedly wake this nameless child up. And so finally, after too many repetitions of this, Ellen just said to Emily, if you oversleep tomorrow, in fact, you oversleep in the next week, I'm just going to leave you there. Ellen happened to teach at the same school our kids went to. And she says, you're old enough to stay home by yourself. But if the teachers ask, are you sick? I'm going to say no. Her absence is unexcused. Don't let her make up her work. That's pretty rough stuff. Sometimes it's just allowing those things to unfold. There's other times, though, when there's too much at stake related to the future. And a consequence, it's actually sometimes appropriate to create that consequence. I got to tell you one more story. But we went on vacation, and when we came back from vacation, I found out that most of the guys in the neighborhood, they'd started a new club. It was called the Hawk Club, like hawk, the bird of prey. And I'm like, okay, I want to be in the Hawk Club. And they go, well, you got to go through the initiation. And I said, what's the initiation? And they said, well, the reason it's called the Hawk Club is because to get into this club, you got to go into a store and you got to take something and you got to leave without paying for it or getting caught. You're like a hawk who swoops down, grabs something in your claws. You bring it to us. In fact, one of us will go with you and watch to make sure you don't really pay for it because, Phil, you're such a little goody two-shoes that, you know, you're just little Mr. Perfect boy. You got to really do this if you want to be in this club. I wanted to be in that club. I thought, what will I do? I liked to play baseball a lot growing up. I was never very good. Both of my kids, Emily was a good softball player. Philip played 4 years in college baseball. I was never very good, but I liked baseball. And a lot of my friends had really nice baseball gloves. I had my dad's old glove, and if you've seen old-timey baseball gloves, they weren't even gloves. They're just this piece of leather with sort of some finger holes in it, and the ball would bounce off of it. I really wanted a new glove, and I'd asked my parents for one. They're like, those are expensive. Maybe someday, not now. Things are a little tight. So I decided that's what I'm going to steal. And I went to this store, and it wasn't a big department store. It was just kind of a family-run store. And there was a glove, and it was a lot like this one. This is one of my son's first baseman gloves, and he's a lefty. Mine went on the other hand. But I stole that glove, and it was a sweet glove. And all of a sudden, I was a better outfielder because of that glove. I could catch balls that I was missing before. It just gave me confidence as a ball player. But I also hated that glove. And every time I picked up that glove, I felt guilt because I know where it had come from. I knew what I had done. And so I had this love-hate relationship with that baseball glove. And one time Mom asked me, she goes, "Where'd you get that glove anyway?" And I lied about it. And about a week or two later, my dad asked me. And for whatever reason, I always found it harder to lie to my father. And when he asked that, it was like, finally, I can come clean about this. And so I started to cry, and I slid the glove over to him. I said, "The hot club, I stole the glove, and I hate that glove, and I know it was wrong." And he goes, "Okay." He goes, "You need to return that glove to the man who owns that store." And I said, "Good, will you call him and tell him about that?" I can still remember this like it was yesterday. My dad goes, "I don't remember stealing the baseball glove. I think you did that, son." So I had to make the call. I had to make the appointment. And my dad at least went with me and had the glove in a bag. And I kind of looked at my dad like, "Okay, why don't you tell him what happened?" And my dad's kind of like, "I don't remember stealing the glove, son. I think you did that. This is your story to share." And I took that glove, and again, the tears came, and I explained to the man what I had done, and I said I was so sorry. And I knew he'd probably make me pay for the glove because it was kind of beat up from wear. And the man said, "You know what? I lose thousands of dollars a year when people shoplift. I've had a bunch of stuff stolen from me. Son, I don't remember ever somebody voluntarily coming back to make it right when I didn't catch them." He looked at my dad. He says, "I don't know what you're doing in your home, but you must be doing something right. Son," he says, I want you to keep this glove because I'm really proud of you." I took that glove and I held it. I don't remember if I thought this, but in my mind, the way I remember it is, there is a God and he knows my name. Because this was awesome what had just happened. My dad is kind of shy, more like Emily's personality. My dad, hear him clear his throat, and he says, "Sir, that's not acceptable." And I'm like, "Did you not hear what the guy just said? I'm forgiven, and I get the glove. Let's go home." And he goes, "I don't believe that will teach my son what he needs to learn. I think he needs to return the glove to you." And the man says, "Well, I can't sell it anyway. It's been used." He goes, "Wait." Says, "Whatever that glove cost," he said, "my son will work for you for twice that much time to pay for that glove twice. And then if you want to give it to him, if you're satisfied with his work, you can do it." What's he doing? You know what I thought at that point? I can remember my dad, because my dad, and I've talked about this story, goes, "Do you remember me saying that he shouldn't probably let you work the cash register?" And I go, "Yeah, that was a real cheap shot. I remember that now." But anyway, I remember thinking, even on the way home, I was steaming. I didn't say a word. I thought, how did I lose the dad lottery? I wish I had any dad but this dad. This dad hates me. You know, you got to have courage to let your kids experience consequences. You got to be secure as a mom or a dad. You hear so many parents say, "I just want to be my son, my daughter's best friend." You know what? There's multiple people in this world who could be the best friend of your son or daughter. You're the only one that can be their mom or their dad. It's amazing how differently I look at that story, that memory now. My dad didn't hate me. That's one of the clearest expressions from my whole childhood that proved just how much my dad really, really loved me. Like the dad in the story who let his rebellious son experience consequences. Like our Father in heaven who sometimes loves us enough to say, "I have all power. I could intervene and fix this, but I love you too much to enable you by doing that." That's the message of this session on consequences. Because the vision is this: if we will allow our kids to experience consequences, I mean, sometimes you got to rescue them if it's something too severe, too serious, but I'm talking about on a daily, weekly basis. If we will allow our kids to experience consequences, they are much more likely to grow up to be responsible adults. As tonight you go into your huddle time, that's the topic. The topic is consequences. And why don't you share, and again, mom or dad, you take the lead in this. Maybe you've been one of those parents who, I would never tell my kid that I smoked, or I would never tell my kid I stole something. Why? Why? The goal is not they think you're perfect. The goal is that they understand we're all imperfect, which is why we need a perfect God who loved us enough that Jesus would die in our place. So share a story when you made a poor choice, when you experienced some consequences. You want to balance that out sometime with a story about when you did something good and there were good choices? Do that. But tonight, focus on when you made a poor choice and the resulting fruit that grew as a result of that. And kids, if you've ever wanted to tell your parents the truth about something that you did, if you got a baseball glove tucked underneath your mattress, this is gold. This is amnesty night, baby. To pull it out, you will never find your parents more willing to be reasonable in their response. Doesn't mean there won't be consequences. But just to have a conversation, how are choices and consequences in our family? Are they too severe? Are they too strict? Does mom or dad discipline in anger rather than thinking about it first? I think you're going to have a really productive conversation right now in huddle time. And I'd love to hear some of what God does as a result of the next few minutes together. So go for it.